very serious topic, which was discussed for the first time at our summit, was what is the financial toll for all this? Absolutely. We want to have everything on the table, and we want to have access. But there is a cost to bear, and how are we going to be thinking about this? And so I think for me it was really good to see us becoming engaged as a myeloma community to, for the first time, really try to address this. And so the topic was brought up by our colleague Vincent Rajkumar, who had a very interesting way of displaying where we are in myeloma. We have the drugs that we have been using in recent years. We have the old drugs. We have, this is interesting terminology. These are the older novel drugs. So it's hard to know what to call them anymore because we've had them for a while. And so, yes, they're not really novel anymore. And so then we have the recently approved drugs that we've been talking about, with the most recent panobitastat, of course. And then this list includes a number that we've just been touching on. We have all the, including the marizumab, daratumumab, the SAR. We have all of those coming along, okay? And so where are we with the treatment? We have the mild triplets. And so what Vincent meant by this is that it has a novel agent in it, but it has a non-novel agent. It has bortezomib with Cytoxan. And from a financial standpoint, what is being addressed here is that one has an expensive drug and a cheap drug. So one has a mild, in terms of the impact on the wallet. One then has what Vincent called a true triplet, which is two of the newer agents together, like Revlimid, Velcade, etc., and then moving up to Kyprolis with Revlimid or pomalidomide. And then one has what we were starting to talk about. We have our triplets, and then we add in ELO or DARA, panobitastat, etc. And so this is clearly the way that we're thinking. And so what are we going to do about this? Because the final category is total wallet failure. I mean, what are we going to do here? All these combos are just going to exhaust us, you know, total therapy, you know, 8. We need to have some way to be thinking about this. And so we also need to be aware as a global community that when we're looking at drugs for approval and we're looking at combinations that we might recommend, that are these individual drugs available? Are they accessible globally? And so we need to be looking at that in terms of recommendations that we might make. And in the US, we're actually very, very fortunate. Less fortunate in Canada, UK, and Europe. Asia Pacific and developing countries, complex pictures, co-pay situation in the Asia Pacific with limited access, many developing countries, very limited access to new agents. And, you know, as educators and speakers, we often go to these places, and I have to say it's often quite troubling to be talking about new drugs that might not be accessible. And so the question is, and I've left this question rather open, because I think that we need to consider together, how are we going to start looking into this problem? And so who would like to comment first? Huh? No, I could potentially just keep talking. But
no, I think the fact that we discussed it at the summit, Brian, is the first step. It's just, yes. I think so often as physicians in particular, part of us wants to say, I really don't care about cost whatsoever. I just want the best for my patient. And I agree with that concept and modality, but I can still advocate strongly for my patient being cognizant of that cost. You know, especially in this situation, whereas we've heard in some of these countries and places where, you know, people are selling their homes and becoming entirely bankrupt for, we're not sure if it's really adding that much more to the combination. So it's driving us for better science to prove unequivocally what combinations are working the best. But also behooves us because we do have influence, we do have respect to some degree in the community and at the economic levels and political levels to say, we can't be in a situation where what we arrive at in a clinical trial, that here is this great combination of drugs that Professors Richardson, Langren, Dury, and McHale have come up with, but no one's ever going to fund that, so we can't do it. So we want to advocate for a streamlined process, a process that respects the way our economy works, but also respects the value that it brings to the patient. And so just being at the table, I think discussing amongst ourselves was step one. Step two is us getting at those key important tables. Prior to coming to the US, I was in Canada. I was involved in the committee that advised the government about certain drugs, and it changed, from us just advising, saying, the data is good, we should cover this drug, to a point where it was a tripartite table now, where we were 1/3 of the table all of a sudden instead of being the whole table, with another third being experts in pharmacoeconomics and a third being the government regulators. And that's just the reality of where we lived. But I think that notion is important for us to say we want to be at the table, we want to advocate for our patients, we want to look at what solutions there can be, because these drugs are not going to instantly get cheaper. So if anything, they're going to be more expensive as they're more and more difficult to develop. So
this element of being at a table is a key point, I think. Absolutely. And so there was quite a bit of discussion about that, about creating this table that people would come to and collectively discuss this.
And I think even that we discussed it amongst ourselves just raised the awareness of it. Because I think a lot of times we may not fully appreciate the kind of impact it has on our patients.
But I thought, Joe, that the session, which was a privilege to be part of, I thought Jean-Luc's perspective was fascinating, because he dissected the European mechanism, and I understood things that I had not appreciated before. Yes. And not least was that the German model is driven by the fact that they have a GDP that's the best in Europe, and they commensurately reflect that in how they deal with drug approval. And
but I mean, they were the only country highlighted that was capable of dealing with it in that way.
Exactly. But, speaking to my mother country, to the British situation, with the cancer drug fund that was built by David Cameron, there's, thank God, been the relief of that sort of travesty of the NICE model, which was really so devastating for cancer patients in particular. But recognizing that we're dealing with healthcare systems where the problems are substantial. I'm just reminded of a few sort of simple facts. At the end of the day, drug and device cost for the total US healthcare budget is 10%. 90% is everything else. And as we discussed at the meeting, I'm particularly struck that, for example, in our own Partners Health system, we're investing $2 billion in Massachusetts alone in one system, Partners, for the federally required computer system. $2 billion. That's what we're spending. Now, as we think of it in that context, we sort of have to then frame, well, let's go from the ground up here. Where are our problems in drug development? Where do they lie? And I personally think, from my own sort of granular experience, that in drug development, I'm very struck by how the cost of clinical trials can be exorbitant, and it can be driven by no good reason. We've seen contract research organizations for the same RFA bid at 25 million versus 5 million. This is crazy. And as a myeloma community of invested researchers, and I say invested in the best sense of the word, we're there to get the drugs approved as quickly as we can for our patients, as cheaply as we can.
We should engage and ask them to go from 25 to 5. Yes.
Well, but also, Brian, preserve quality, because what you don't
absolutely.
want, you don't
want.
No,
please don't misunderstand.
No,
that quality is key.
It's key, but what is the difference between, say, 10 million and 25?
Right.
Huge from a study budget. It would have crippled us. We would never have been able to do the trial.
So Ola, what do you think about all this?
Well, I think that the first step that we could all do, and I think you did so beautifully and initiated here, and we continue talking about it, is to increase the awareness about these things and to continue talking about it, because this is an evolving problem for everybody. If you look in the cancer statistics, a likelihood of a male unfortunately being diagnosed with any cancer, I think 2 out of 3 males between birth and death will have a malignant disease, and I think for females it's 50%, so it's pretty high numbers. So this is not a trivial problem for the population, so we have to just deal with it. Right. So other things I was thinking about is that because the situation is so different in different parts of the world, I think it's obviously not going to be an easy solution. So I think that maybe just the awareness factor is maybe the key thing that we as a group could kind of bring to the table. And then each country and each region probably has to come up with its own solution, I think.
Right.
And another thing I was also thinking about is that we think about all these expensive drugs as a big problem, but I guess you could try to flip the whole story and say, if you really took the best drugs right away, could you cure the disease? And then maybe the cost would be lower.
And so
which is right?
And so this was a point that was raised by several people at the meeting, is that we as the clinicians do have some responsibility in guiding towards that in terms of therapy that is really attempting to have that deep response that will have the best outcome, but in a cost-efficient way. And to be looking at that maintenance to say, well, you know, that's going to be expensive. How much of that do we really need to look at a protocol that works well, but also is considering the cost aspect?
Go ahead.
Yeah? No, I was just going to say, I completely agree. And I think that as we think about, for example, regulatory burdens that can be massive, you know, they need to be streamlined and rationalized. As we think about costs of drug development in the broader sense, I'm always reminded about tuberculosis. If one thinks about it.
I can't see it pops into my mind. But
Well, let me explain why. Let me explain why. Because if you think about it, when TB dominated the world, it was the equivalent of $1 trillion healthcare industry. You had sanitariums, you had the morbidity and the mortality of a dreadful scourge.
Right.
Then along came 4 antibiotics,
Right.
and boom, gone. So I think, you know, one's reminded, to your point, Ola, that if we get it right with the best drugs, you know,
absolutely.
costs.
We may not have the same impact.
No, I
on
agree.
TB.
I'm not going to say TB,
But
but
no,
we're
that's
close,
important.
you know.
I mean, some of the
Exactly,
work I used to do is in
That's it.
pharmacoeconomic modeling, and we would
Yeah.
look at these exact things and say, here is a relatively more expensive drug, but if the outcomes are that much better.
Exactly.
So for some of the work, for example, that we did, we were looking at introducing, this was in a different disease, just as an example, in lymphoma, of introducing a monoclonal antibody that actually rescued a significant number of patients from later on having to have a transplant, which was much more expensive.
Absolutely.
So I use the analogy that, you know, are you going to keep driving the old clunker that you're going to keep pouring gas into every month, or have a bit of an upfront cost, buy a, you know, cost-efficient car, and then you're going to save in the long term on gas and maintenance and so on. But that's part of the solution. I'm not sure that's the whole of the solution. I think some sheer advocacy, as many physicians and hematologists in particular in this country have been taking to help see that, as Jean-Luc taught us, sometimes the cost of drug development is more than just drug development. It's really just what the market can bear.
Right.
And the market is different for bringing an Oreo cookie to the store that people are going to spend money for than a drug that's going to rescue someone's life. And so I think there has to be, we don't want to push so hard that there's no incentive to create new drugs. On the other hand, there's perhaps a way to curtail it somewhat. So I think this is a complex issue. Anything economic is complex. Not one strategy is going to solve it, but multiple strategies. And I'm just thankful that we as a myeloma community are one of the few tumor sites, frankly, I think, that have really worked hard to try and come together and start finding solutions and advocate for our patients.
Well, and I think that points to something that's very positive, which is that we have an extremely good relationship with our pharma partners. It's very constructive. And I think there's a dialogue that's very, you know, there's an element of partnership and trust and respect for each other that means that we can engage, and in which, you know, our pharma partners don't feel threatened. This is not an attack on them. This is a rational strategy. How can we make this more available globally? And I'm very struck that in our clinical trials efforts, for example, the readiness with which our pharma partners are willing to provide free drug, and also in other situations to provide drug for people in need. That's a very striking and very, very important, and something that perhaps isn't people aren't fully aware of in the broader community, that how lucky we are in myeloma that there are so many mechanisms to access medicines that are not otherwise necessarily immediately available. But I do agree with you, Joe. It's a very complex equation, and I think that we have to engage it. And I think in cancer broadly, as you know, at ASCO, a plenary session was dedicated to this. And so I think, Brian, your setting it as part of the agenda here was particularly poignant, and I think it was received very well, and I think we've got a constructive platform for going forward.
And I think that partnership with Pharma was also appreciated in terms of prospectively looking at trials together.
Exactly.
To
make it
see
more efficient.
What
keep
are the
costs
best
down.
kinds of trials that will get efficacy answers, but also some cost answers as well.
But we need to keep on talking about it now.
Yes.
We started talking
Yes.
about it, so we need to keep on talking about it in our trials and at our meetings. We probably should have a slide for our presentations and say when it comes to costs.
Right.
This is, even if it's not perfect, at least put some kind of measure there.
But I'm very struck by how in the clinical trials process there could be enormous efficiencies gained. And I think that that's our regulatory piece, that some of that burden needs to come down, because it is just crushing us in the US right now.
This was discussed by several.
Several investigators. There was a unanimity amongst the US investigators that were being buried in this regulatory challenge that is almost impenetrable. And at the same time, however, to help our pharma partners realize that, do we need 600-700 patient trials with all the cost that goes into that, or can we be much more selective as we move to more targeted therapy?
Yeah, so all these different aspects need to be considered a multifactorial solution here.
Right.
So
Completely
It
agree.
almost comes back to what we talked about before, like how to get drugs approved, what the endpoints are, and kind of takes us all the way back there, like how we're going to design the approval process for the new drugs.
Yeah, exactly. In partnership, recognizing that we've been also very fortunate that our FDA partners, certainly speaking for the US, our FDA partners have been remarkably helpful to date.
And so the partners who've actually helped us with this particular program are now on the screen, and we really, really do appreciate it to have this opportunity to discuss and have people learn what was happening here in Vienna at the summit and in these recent months at ASCO and upcoming here at EHA. And so on behalf of the IMF, I'd like to thank my colleagues here for taking time out of their busy schedule to help think and talk about some of these really, really important issues that are important for all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.